I'm Christopher Lydon, and this is Open Source, getting our heads around the invasion of Venezuela and what feels like a rough new rule book for the so-called world order. Cue Greg Grandin. Greg, you're the hemispheric historian who wrote that big book, América, just in time last summer. And you gave us a memorable spoken version of it. Seems to me now, Greg, that you saw a lot of this coming, and very specifically, the invasion and the decapitation of the Maduro regime in Venezuela. The big theme in your book was the very dicey business of sovereignty, historically, between North and South America. And Donald Trump has been teasing at that instability of borders and labels ever since he renamed the Gulf of Mexico the Gulf of America. He's teasing us again this week when he says Cuba could be next, even Colombia, on the list for invasion or regime change. Where are we, Greg Grandin, and just how did we get here?
Well, I mean, like many things with Trump, you have to kind of work backwards from the most ludicrous to the larger geopolitical and wonder which variable is most consequential in decisions reached. I mean, most of the reporting kind of holds that Trump was opposed to doing any kind of military intervention in the long run against Maduro, that he was willing to make some negotiating deals. And eventually Rubio convinced him. Apparently what the last straw was watching Maduro dance. That apparently was the trigger, and he gave the go-ahead. So, there's a lot of things that operate in Trump's mind. The larger picture, I think, is, the U.S. always turns to Latin America when its bid for global dominance fails. And if we're looking at this in the long run, the United States, as this administration has said very clearly in its national security strategy paper, that the function of the United States as superintending of global world order, in which all players play by a certain set of common rules regarding property and regarding governance, is no longer at play. That each region kind of needs to retreat into itself, and each hegemon has to get its hinterlands in order. This is a classic move that's happened in the past. Every time the United States' bid for global power failed, it turns back to Latin America. And I think we're seeing that with Trump.
What are the past examples that suggest that, Greg?
Well, you could think about World War I and the failure of the League of Nations, and the United States has turned back to Latin America. You could think about the Great Depression after the Roaring Twenties, when the United States was really making a kind of bid for financial dominance under the creation of the Federal Reserve Board and the internationalization of the U.S. banking industry. And then there was this huge, enormous crash. And Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal, to a large degree, was saved by Latin America. His support for economic nationalism and economic social democracy in Latin America became the framework for a new way of thinking about the global order, kind of legitimated a kind of social democracy.
Yep.
And many in Latin America expected that the world after World War II would become social democratic. But even in the United States, Roosevelt's kind of tolerance of cultural pluralism, his notion of, economic justice, harmonized with a kind of vision in Latin America that stabilized the region under U.S. tutelage. And in turn, Latin America became absolutely indispensable in the run-up to World War II. Now, when the New Deal kind of reaches its limits in the 1970s and begins to unravel, and you have the rise of the New Right, they then turn to Latin America, right? After defeat in Vietnam and defeat in Tehran, and third world nationalism, nationalizing large chunks of its industry and cutting off sources of capital investment for U.S., Reagan turns to Latin America. And his vision of Latin America is a kind of very muscular anti-communism, but it's forward-looking. It elevates the language of freedom and liberation from tyranny. And obviously we know the brutality that underwrote it, but it was still a kind of forward-looking ideology. And in both cases, in both the New Deal and the New Right, this turn to Latin America allowed both of these ascendant political coalitions, which had ambitions to become national movements, governing coalitions, use Latin America to reconcile different contradictory constituencies within its base. So the New Deal
Hmm.
managed to use Latin America to satisfy corporations who wanted open markets at the same time that it was placating economic nationalists in Latin America. Under the new right, you saw Reagan use Central America as a way of bringing together theocons and neocons
Hmm.
together in Iran Contra. But the thing in both cases is both with FDR and with Reagan, they were able to transform their vision into a kind of domestic hegemony. I don't want to get too technical, but foreign policy really is the place that hegemony gets worked out in the United States, where world visions are concocted after the failure of the last one. That kind of re explains the world, gives a normative view of how the world could be operating. So, again, with Roosevelt, it was a kind of New Deal social democracy. With Reagan, it was a kind of liberal anti communism. So now we have Trump. And what is Trump doing? Trump is flailing around in Latin America and he is attempting to build a continental wide movement. The language of the Monroe Doctrine and his revived Monroe Doctrine clearly says that he's giving priority to getting Latin America organized. But he doesn't really have the kind of vision that would translate into kind of domestic hegemony, right? What Trump is doing in Latin America, as what he's doing domestically, is really just a kind of perpetual ongoing polarization. There's not going to be any transcendence of the polarization with some kind of new hegemonic vision. Trumpism power comes from the culture wars, the constant conflict, the constant sense of grievance.
Interesting.
So even though he's doing what has long been done by other presidents turning to Latin America, he's doing it. What's distinct about him is that he's not using the opportunity to put forward a transcendent vision of hegemony that could overcome domestic polarization. And hence, it will just lead to more conflict and more provocation and more escalation.
Greg, what was the 19th century model for this kind of high handed relationship? And how did it work out?
Well, this was the model. The 19th century was the model. I mean, for much of the 19th century, whether it be prior to the Civil War, when the southern states had control of foreign policy, and they wound up taking Texas and they wound up taking half of Mexico. You want to talk about annexation and high handed imperialism. I mean, Trump has nothing on James Polk. and, or whether it be the post Civil War Republican restoration, where they took the lead in expansion and fighting Native American wars and winning the West, but then also moving on into the Caribbean with the War of 1898 and taking Cuba and taking Puerto Rico and taking Guam. Trump is a shadow of that to a large degree, but there is no doubt that that is the world in which he is invoking and wishes that he lived in, but he doesn't because the world is much more complicated than it was back then.
Greg Grandin, it's striking to me that it's the historian who seems to be ahead of the game here in analyzing this story. You were writing op-ed in the New York Times just a year ago when you anticipated an expansionist turn in American foreign policy in Trump's second presidency, a turn that could undo the modern so-called rules-bound global order. The headline on your piece in the Times was Trump dreams of a new American empire. That's only one piece of the story, but can we see it now in Venezuela and how it could work?
Yes and no. We see that Trump is very limited in what he can do. He could do these surgical strikes. And it is interesting when he gave his press conference. And in his press conference, he went on to list all of the other surgical strikes in Iran and Nigeria, in Yemen. There's no appetite among his base to have boots on the ground and have a kind of unending war. And neither is there in Venezuela. I mean, just the fact that he said that the United States was now running Venezuela created
Right.
an uproar among the American firsters. He's a little bit in a double bind because American firsters like dominating Latin America. And Latin America is the place where the supposed isolationism of America first becomes internationalism. Because through the Monroe Doctrine, they think that the United States is a place where nationalists become internationalists. But there's no appetite for regime change, there's no appetite for nation building. So he's come up with this weird concoction of like, we're going to take out Maduro and we're going to keep the status quo, the whole Maduro state in place, because it turns out that they're quite efficient in terms of administrative oil, at least this Delcy Rodriguez is. And we're going to cut out our natural allies. And this creates a number of problems. One is the broader coalition, American First Nationalists, might like the idea that Trump is just going to work with hardliners in Venezuela just to get the oil back. But Greater Miami or Greater Florida, that section
Yep.
within the Republican coalition that sees Venezuela as the first step to a retaking of all of Latin America, Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua, and then isolating the two big countries that are still very center left and still very competent and efficient, and that's Brazil and that's Mexico. That seems to be put on hold under this scenario. I mean, Cuba is going to have a hard time. It's unclear exactly to what degree the new client state of Venezuela is going to continue to try to aid Cuba with oil, or to what degree Trump or Marco Rubio is going to say that that's one of the conditions that they will not allow.
Greg, speak of the Marco Rubio piece of this whole story. I've watched Rubio kind of carefully in his first months. He always seems to have a kind of blank stare, not looking into the middle distance. I don't know what he's thinking. And yet suddenly now you see the zealous guy with Cuban roots and a Cuban or anti-Cuban constituency. What's going on there? And remind us also how Venezuela and Venezuelan oil has kept Cuba afloat a lot of this time. It was very helpful to what was left of the Castro regime.
Yeah. Venezuela and the rise of Chavez, and Chavez during the height of his powers was instrumental in throwing a major lifeline to Cuba, to the Cuban Revolution, which lost, when the Soviet Union fell and Eastern Europe fell, Cuba was isolated. It survived, but then through the aid of Venezuela, it managed to get a better foothold and stabilize itself a bit. So the island is in trouble. The nation is in deep crisis economically. People are fleeing Cuba en masse. It's losing population. It has rolling blackouts. Cuba is in trouble. And certainly Marco Rubio's Florida constituents smell blood. But my larger point was that I think that, this deal in which Trump sells out Maria Machado and basically aligns with hardline Maduro, second-tier Maduro officials is seen as a betrayal among the Florida right. And that is who Marco Rubio represents to a large degree, and that's where he comes out of. And it's clear that Marco Rubio sees Venezuela as the first step towards finally ending the Cuban Revolution.
Wow. Is that a reasonable expectation?
I think things are bad. I mean, it depends on how much pressure the United States puts on Venezuela to cut all aid to Cuba, I think, is an open question. I mean, as of now, we have no idea what exactly it is the United States is telling Venezuela to do. You can imagine scenarios where they come up with a plan, the people in charge in Venezuela, Delcy Rodriguez and others, send it to the National Assembly and they debate it and they stall and whatnot. And Trump loses interests and the military force in the Caribbean has been reassigned elsewhere. And it's hard to imagine that they would ramp it up again just to take out Delcy Rodriguez. I find that hard to believe. It's clear that they went to a lot of trouble to find a legal justification, even though it's a lot of crap and bullshit. But they are calling it a police action, and they put him on trial because they are trying to use the same justification that was used for Manuel Noriega. So they obviously feel some pressure from Congress and some limits placed on Congress to what they can do and how they can justify it. But yeah, Cuba, I think, is in dire shape and it's isolated. And China provides some aid, Russia provides some aid, Venezuela was providing some aid, but it's in trouble.
Greg, managing the Western Hemisphere as our empire is almost simple compared to the effects on the so-called global world order. Speak of that and some of the risks that are involved. You wrote in the Times that there are dangers here, and Trump's fumbling around for a policy in Latin America was treating international politics as if it were a game of risk. He's signaling that the world is governed by new rules now, which are really old rules. The powerful do what they will, the weak suffer what they must. For all its shortcomings and hypocrisies, you wrote, the global order that emerged at the end of World War II promoted the idea that cooperation, not aggression, should be the presumed starting point of diplomacy. Where do we begin to see the effects in the wider world?
We see the effects in the wider world in this notion that the world is no longer being thought of as a unified entity governed by a set of shared rules, and with all of its hypocrisy and all of its self-interest being superattended by the United States. What you have is very clearly, and it was laid out in last month's national security strategy paper, which each administration is mandated to put out, first or second year of their administration, that it explicitly said that we're going back to a kind of balance of power world order,
right,
in which each regional hegemon is in charge of getting their hinterlands under control. So in China, you have the South China Sea, and in Russia, you have, what were the Soviet satellites, and Ukraine, and the United States, you have Latin America. But at the same time, the United States, even though it's explicitly saying that this is the new international system, has not taken back any of its own ambitions globally. It still claims the right to act anywhere in the world globally that it wants. So it's unclear what will happen if China does move on Taiwan. Will the United States stay out of it, or will the United States act to prevent it? These are all kind of questions that are up in the air, and they're profoundly precarious and profoundly dangerous. Latin American independence leaders early on in the 1800s, they looked around and they said, what theory of sovereignty are we going to have?
Right.
They said, what's available to us? Let's look at the United States. The United States is unique. The United States is a republic alone on an empty or empty enough continent, and their theory of sovereignty is basically the doctrine of conquest. They're going to move west. We can't do that because we are 7 republics on an already filled up continent. We can't act like the United States did, or we'd be in constant war. And then they looked at Europe for the balance of power, the post-Napoleonic balance of power. And Bolivar and other Latin American leaders insisted that, balance of power without any transcendent notion of a higher good will always lead to world war. You'll always have some upstart toppling the balance of power. If you have one country pushing its interests against another, eventually something's going to give way. And first regional and then world war will result. And Bolivar was right. He was 100 years right. He foresaw World War I and World War II in the 1820s. And so Latin America came up with this idea of basically that the international system needed to be organized around the idea of cooperation, that nations had mutual interests, that it wasn't an inherent law of the jungle. Nations could cooperate, that we could have a global system based on cooperation. And that was really the only alternative. And that is exactly what Trump is overturning in Latin America now and in the world.
In the New York Times today, there's a glimpse of another world of balance of power and spheres of influence as they've never been quite so explicit before. Fiona Hill testified in Congress, the Times said, that 7 years ago, in the original Trump presidency, Russia, that is Putin, offered to allow the United States free rein in Venezuela if Washington gave Russia a free hand in Ukraine. Could that have happened, and would it be a better or more dangerous world if that were the new practice?
I mean, it could have happened, but I don't think it explained what happened. I mean, I think diplomats and leaders and politicians say things all the time, and they imagine they're playing a great game of chess. I don't think that Trump was waiting for Putin's authorization for his whatever decision he made about Venezuela. I don't think there was a one-on-one trade-off. I think there's a lot of constraints and variables that will determine how the United States continues to engage Russia over Ukraine. I don't think just because the United States did this in Venezuela, then just going to give the go-ahead for Russia to do the same thing to Zelensky in the Ukraine. I doubt that very much. But the larger point is more important, is that it does create a world in which these things are imaginable. It does create a world in
Right.
which, as I said in that earlier piece that you quoted, that I had forgotten that I wrote, that the doctrine of conquest is that Trump came into office. All of those things he said were speech acts. You know, we're going to rename the Gulf of Mexico. We're going to take Greenland. Maybe we'll take Canada, and we want Panama back. At the time, I thought whether he does any of these things or not, what he's doing is he's reviving the doctrine of conquest as a legitimate doctrine. And basically, Venezuela is a demonstrative effect of that. You know, he came into power saying that he was going to do these things. He hasn't done any of them yet, other than rename the Gulf of Mexico to the Gulf of America. He hasn't taken Greenland and he hasn't taken Canada. But, you know, he has effectively declared that Venezuela is a subsidiary of the United States.
It's hard not to imagine that he's showing us a vision of a world with three overwhelming regional powers. The United States in the Western Hemisphere, that's ours, thank you. Russia, probably the great power in Europe, and China, of course, in the Far East.
Yeah.
And leave them all to themselves. We won't mess with your borders, and you won't mess with ours. Could we all live happily ever after? What is the danger in that kind of division of the world?
Because it's not just that the United States wants to live with China. It understands China as an existential threat. And, you know, certainly in Latin America, I mean, the Venezuela action was partly directed at China because China did get some oil from Venezuela and had invested an enormous amount of money in Venezuela as it is in Latin America. So the reassertion of the Monroe Doctrine is basically putting a chip down on Latin America and warning China. Now, the fact is that China is embedded in Latin America. It's not going anywhere. I mean, there's no way they're going to roll back all of the investments and infrastructure investments. And a lot of it is just rhetoric. Argentina is, Javier Milei is basically a Trump acolyte, and he's taken the 20, 40 billion, whatever it is, in order to prop up the US peso. But he's still doing a China swap with the peso with China in order to hold it up. So he's still doing business with China. He's still selling soybeans to China. You could assert that the Monroe Doctrine will roll back China's influence in Latin America, but I don't see how that happens in any real way. And to get back to your original question, it's not just three hegemons that are happily living after. It's China is seen as a major threat, as it should be. I don't mean that China should be considered a threat, but China has, you know, invested in an enormous amount of money in green technology and tech, and it's leapfrogged over Europe and the United States. And the only way to contain that is through these very aggressive market measures, which are frankly completely unjust and contrary to the rules that China agreed to play by when it joined the WTO.
Greg, part of the righteous Trump rationale for the invasion of Venezuela is that Maduro was deep into narcotics and drug trafficking of every kind that was ruining America. Do we take this seriously or not?
No, it's completely ridiculous. The Department of Justice just had to admit that there is no such thing as the Cartel Los Soles. That it's just basically made up. You know, basically, the cocaine comes from Colombia. A little bit of it is transshipped over Venezuela into the Caribbean and makes its way to the United States. The vast majority of it goes through Ecuador, which is an ally of the United States, and comes up through the Pacific. But, you know, there's corruption. Certainly, the higher-ups in the military are corrupt without any doubt. And do they take payoffs? Of course. Do they take bribes from drug runners? Of course they do. Did some of that money reach Maduro? I have no idea. But it's one thing to preside over a military or a police force that takes bribes and isn't corrupt. It's another thing to say that that military itself is a cartel. You know, that's just pure fiction.
We speak routinely of Donald Trump as a pawn of the billionaire class. What does the billionaire class want here? And did they have a hand in this invasion?
Trump is Trump. He is unique. And obviously, we all underestimated his, I gag a little bit when I say this word, but his charisma, his staying power, his appeal to a large percentage of the electorate, which I think also has to do with the bankruptcy of the Democratic Party. I don't think he would have won in 2016 or 2024 if the Democratic Party had put up a viable candidate. He ran on a very anti-systemic sentiment, a moment when people wanted something different. He both named the corruption and rottenness of the system, even as he embodied the corruption and rottenness of the system. Obviously, he has ties to fossil fuel.
Yep.
There's a kind of fossil fuel fascism that is international in scope. And I think that that's one of the points of alliance with Putin. There is the tech overlords, especially this term, which seems to be getting whatever they want in terms of deregulation and being let off the leash when it comes to, AI and cyber currencies, certainly finance. There's different sectors of the US economy that, Trump might not have been their first pick, but they certainly saw an opportunity when they had one. This term, the irony of it is that Trump seemed more involved and invested and attentive in his first term. But in his first term, he was surrounded himself with Republican establishment politicians. And I guess he felt hemmed in. This term, he seems a little bit completely out of it, but the people around him are much more ideological and much more efficient. The author of Plan 2025, Marco Rubio, Miller, like these people have an agenda. They're ideological.
Speak of it. Take it apart.
Yeah, well, you have Miller, who has this vicious vision. It's deeply racist that represents a kind of deep nativism that wants to return the United States back to pre-1964 immigration reform.
Let me quote him. Stephen Miller talking to Jake Tapper on CNN. But he said, "We live in a world, in the real world, that is governed by strength, that is governed by force, that is governed by power." He said, "These are the iron laws of the world since the beginning of time."
Yeah, and that guy, he wouldn't last a minute in a world like that. If he was thrown back into medieval times, first of all, he'd probably be burnt at the stake because he's Jewish. This weird distancing himself from his own Judaism and his embrace of a kind of Visigoth medievalism, I don't know, or Saxon Valhalla, a Nordic Valhalla or whatever. There's Hegseth and this cult of masculinity. And, there's lots of different ideological currents that flow into this. The fear of demographic change, the white natalism, the sense that white people aren't having enough babies, which is very prominent in Silicon Valley. It's a cesspool of ideologies that have ideologues in positions of power. Miller, Hegseth, J.D. Vance.
I have to wonder, is it policy or is it slogans and prejudices and sort of inchoate dreams, fantasies of power?
Yeah, it's that. It's the culture wars.
Yep.
But there's plenty of ways in which they can instantiate the culture wars by taking Black people out of the Smithsonian Institution or something, or whatever they're doing. I mean, there's always some, Hegseth insisting that everybody has to shave. There's no shave variances, and that's obviously targeted against African American men. It is like cosplay or as opposed to policy, but they always manage to find places to poke and prod and keep the fires of the culture wars burning.
Turning the subject a little bit, you wrote an important book a few years ago called Kissinger's Shadow, detailing the effects that sort of master strategist in his time was still exerting influence on official American behavior. What would Henry Kissinger make of this move toward not only the New World Order, but to an unembarrassed Western Hemispheric empire?
At first, he liked Trump because he liked politicians that could transcend and overcome the bureaucracy and not be bound down by protocols and rules, and people who had the vision to kind of break free and create, new realities. I think that even Kissinger would be a little shocked at what was going on, the profound instability that the Trump administration is presiding over, both domestically and internationally.
Would Henry Kissinger have suggestions?
Would he have suggestions? I mean, Trump is so far off the reservation. I can't even imagine what kind of conversation that they would have. Let's bring it back to Trump. Trump was under the impression that Venezuela was actually part of the United States. But up until a couple of weeks ago.
Oh, no. Really?
Yeah, there was something like that. Yeah, he's getting very confused. He's talking about making sure that the Colombian president will be a one-term president, but he has to be a one-term president because it's in the Colombian constitution. He only has 7 months left in his tenure.
You're prompting me, Greg, to go to a delicate point. It's now commonplace to say that people should have spoken up about Joe Biden's decline, his incapacity, long before his term came to an end. People watch Trump and say, this man is not well. This man calls the Monroe Doctrine the Monroe Document. He never finishes a sentence. It's all kind of impulsive fantasizing. What about the mental, moral condition of Donald Trump?
Yeah, well, it's tricky, right? Because the kind of resistance, the liberal resistance, they said this in his first term that he was in cognitive decline and that they should invoke the 25th. And obviously he was in good enough shape to run a winning campaign, 4 years later. I kind of resist the temptation to focus on what seems to be a kind of cognitive decline. But without doubt, I'd say he's much less involved in running things as opposed to approving things and authorizing things that are much more efficient and much more vicious team of advisors that he has around him.
Sum it up, Greg Grandin, in terms of where we are. Can the policy that we're enacting by force in the hemisphere, implying in the world, can it be done? Can the policy be undone? What is its future?
No, I think Trumpism is an ideology that consumes itself. There is certainly a potential for a pan-American Trumpist movement. So he certainly has natural allies in many countries. But I think Trumpism doesn't have the wherewithal in order to create that coalition because it is fundamentally based on disruption and polarization. I mean, just look at just what happened with Venezuela, right? He had an opportunity to, if he really was going to go in and do Venezuela, then it's quite notable that he somehow managed to remove Maduro, but enrage Florida's anti-communists at the same time who feel betrayed and angered by him. I think there are real impediments to Trumpism being a successful foreign policy configuration. It's more premised on constant disruption and constant polarization.
Where will we see a breakdown first?
Well, we'll see it with the midterm elections. I mean, I think that his popularity at home is quite falling poll numbers, and he has basically a year left before he's going to have real limits placed on him, hopefully, by a Democratic Congress. I mean, that's the only most immediate place that I see a break being put on.
In Latin America, which is your turf after all, what is the most telltale, delicate register of the problems in this new policy? Where are you watching?
The doctrine of sovereignty in Latin America is cherished.
Cherished, but often violated, right?
Well, often violated, yes. But in Latin America, though, the idea of non-intervention and sovereignty is something that they had long fought for and got the United States to agree to back in 1933. And I think that this kind of heavy-handed interventionism does produce a backlash.
Greg Grandin, thank you so much. You're an almost infinite resource on the history and the precedents and maybe the future in Latin America. We count on you, and we deeply appreciate your wisdom on the subject.
Well, thanks so much, Chris. It's always a pleasure to speak with you.
Greg Grandin's masterwork last year was titled America, about the Western Hemisphere's twin continents, North and South, that shaped each other over 5 centuries of war, peace, cooperation, and growth. Professor Grandin teaches at Yale. Here at Open Source, we count on listener support. Big thanks to all of you who made donations at the end of the year. It's not too late to make a New Year's pledge to the first and longest continuing podcast out there. Go to radioopensource.org hub.org/donate. We are proud to be a founding member of Hub and Spoke, a Boston-based collective of independent voices in modern media. Check the wide range of our interests, technology, history, politics, and art, at hubspokeaudio.org. You'll be glad you did. And thank you.